Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Paul Elam with a Voice for Men, and this is the International Men's Movement Program. Tonight, we're on country number 5, Hungary. And what I know about Hungary could not fill a bottle of paprika. Um, but I know they have good paprika there because I always buy the Hungarian, and it's a very basic element in making goulash. So that first 30-second clip was you got everything I know about Hungary, which, so thank goodness I'm also joined by the Romanian Christopher Hitchens, Lucian Valsan. Hi, Lucian. How you doing?
Hi there, everyone. I'm doing fine, except for this sun that is killing my eyes. It's early in the morning in here. It's 9 a.m. in Budapest and 8 and sorry, it's 7 a.m. in Budapest and 8 a.m. in here. And no matter how I put this camera, you'll always see me awfully. But yeah, we'll figure that out.
Okay, maybe this time it won't fall too.
No, it won't.
No, it won't fall. I'm sure that, I mean, everybody has to have an ESMA here and there. That is just an absolute requirement at AVFM. So listen, a couple of things occurred to me. Let's start off with some basics because I'm going to assume that a lot of people that view this probably don't know any more about Hungary than I do. I know that we have Attila Benzer is associated with ABFM. He's a Canadian of Hungarian descent. I've met with his father. I've learned a little bit. But it appears, at least looking at the map, from all the various places that border Hungary, that this would be a very ethnically diverse area. Is that correct?
No.
All right. Well, it looks that way on the map.
Yeah, no, it's not. Actually, it's not at all. In this portion of the world, essentially, every single country that exists now on the current map, once the USSR and the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia have fallen, the ethnic diversity is pretty much non-existent. I mean, in Hungary, something like 97% of the population is Hungarian. In their northern neighbor in Slovakia, something like similar, 90% are Slovaks and 10% Hungarians. In their eastern neighbors, Romania, also something like that, 85% Romanian. So no, the ethnic diversity isn't that obvious. However, that doesn't mean the culture doesn't have enough diversity, because let's not forget the Hungarian people is not at least the culture is not originally European. It's Finno-Ugric, so it's closer to Finland and Estonia, even though they're far away from each other. And also, the many years of Slavic influence have also had their own impact, both on the habits of the Hungarian culture and on the language itself. There are quite a lot of Russian words that are now in the Hungarian language as well. So the culture is quite special, even though the ethnic diversity is no longer a feature.
Well, there you go, folks. I mean, every time I sit down with Lucian to do one of these programs, I learn a lot, and it didn't take long. I assumed, looking at a map and all those multiple bordering nations, that you would have a lot of ethnic crossover. For instance, I live in the state of Texas, bordering with Mexico, and there's a huge ethnic crossover, at least on our side of the border. So a little bit about the history of Hungary, I think, is probably going to be in order. That if we're going to talk about what's going on there in terms of men's rights issues and the like, we probably need to understand what the culture is like to begin with. And I'm going to admit ignorance here again. And this is, I think, I don't have like white American guilt over it, but this is a knowledge deficit in most Americans about Eastern European countries. We don't know a lot about that, which is one of the really good things about this program, is that we get to talk about that stuff. So tell us a little bit just about the general history of Hungary, the Hungarian people, religious, that sort of thing. What is the background, traditional families, that sort of thing. Let us know a little bit about that so that we can launch into talking about modern times with a little more information.
Yes, well, essentially, from a historical point of view, there are two big influencers of the Hungarian culture. That is the Austrian-German culture during the times when Hungary was part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. And earlier than that, it was the Slavonic influence, as I said earlier. And besides these two influences, there have also been smaller influences, also mostly of Slavic origin, coming from the southern part, coming from south of Hungary, i.e., from what many would still think as Yugoslavia, even though Yugoslavia no longer exists. And also, there is especially in the eastern part of Hungary, there have also been some traditional Romanian influence, just like here in Transylvania, where I live, there is a significant Hungarian influence. So in the past, there have been quite a lot of ethnic crossover between the two. Not so much today anymore. Uh, in terms of religion, Hungary is essentially Protestant, but it's a different brand of Protestantism than the one you would encounter in, let's say, the Netherlands. So it's called the Reformist Church. I think it's the right term in English. Although Catholicism is still quite strong in there, Hungary is the exception in this area because, you know, Serbia is Orthodox, Romania is Orthodox, Ukraine is Orthodox, Hungary is not. The reason why I'm saying is a special kind of Protestantism that is practiced in Hungary is precisely because all its neighbors are Orthodox. So obviously, in terms of tradition, a lot of Orthodox elements have been preserved in the Hungarian culture as well, despite the fact that Hungary, at least in the last few centuries, has been closer to Rome than it has been to Constantinople.
Okay, tell us a little bit about Hungarian governance. What is their political system like? Is it a two-party, three-party system, multi-party system? Is the voting similar to what happens in Western Europe? What's that like?
Yeah, the system is multi-party, just like well, essentially everywhere else in Europe. However, in practice, in the last 10 years, or maybe I should say the last 15 years, a portion of the political spectrum has been quite decimated. Some of that process has happened naturally, some of it not so naturally, i.e., aided from someone else by someone else. Sorry. But essentially, the voting system is similar with what you see in France or what you see here in Romania. It's a parliamentary democracy. The president of Hungary is as relevant as the president of Germany. Do you know who the president of Germany is? Precisely. I don't know either, and I couldn't care less. So yeah, it's a parliamentary democracy essentially. The president has only a not even a formal role. I mean, very few people really even know who the president of Hungary is. The prime minister is what matters. And yeah, from this point of view, Hungary is no different than most countries of Europe. I guess the only difference, I compared it with France. Well, in France, the president still matters, but in Hungary, it doesn't. And I guess that's not really a good thing lately, given that the current prime minister, serving, I think, third term, Viktor Orban, maybe he might have needed some counterbalance in there. It would have been great if the president would have been a little bit more important. Unfortunately, he isn't.
Okay. Now, looking back at your own history, your own country's history, has Hungary fallen along a similar parallel coming from what we used to term in the West as Eastern Bloc nations and having experienced life behind the Iron Curtain, living with Russian communism and basically dictatorship from a major superpower next door that was actually running the country? Was there a similar, I know that the people of Romania really have enjoyed and pushed for and reveled in newfound freedom in the last 20 or 30 years. Is that a similar experience to Hungary?
Yes and no. I mean, during communism, Hungary had the privilege that we didn't have, i.e., to be next door to Austria. So, Bulgaria and Romania had the very unfortunate circumstance of not bordering anyone relevant in the West. Hungary did border Austria, so that kind of alleviate some of the problems during communism. However, uh, the underground resistance in Hungary was just as terrified as it was in here, because if anyone remembers from history, Hungary had Russian tanks in the 50s. There was an anti-communist revolution in Budapest in the 50s, and the Russians dealt with it just like they dealt with it in Czechoslovakia a few years later, i.e., sending the tanks in there. So, because of that event, the underground resistance was as terrified as it was in here, or as it was in Czechoslovakia, or later on Czech Republic.
Now, speaking a little bit more about modern times. Okay, so they've come out of the Russian control, and now they're an independent state. Are the laws there more modeled after concepts like free speech, freedom of expression? Is that a value that's held there primarily the same way it is in some other countries that were freed from Russian control?
Well, I have to say that's a tough question, and it depends who you ask. It used to be the case, at least until Viktor Orban won the elections again, and that's why I'm saying it depends who you ask. Some would say it's still the case. Some others, like me, would say it's no longer the case. Viktor Orban was a prime minister in late 90s and early 2000s. Then his government lost the elections, and for a while the socialists ruled the place, and then Viktor Orban came back to power, and he's still a prime minister even today. He won re-elections recently. But the problem is that when at his first governance in late 90s, he was highly appreciated by Western think tanks for his pro-market reforms, free speech, and all the goodies that everyone hoped for when communism finally fell. Now, the problem is that when he was re-elected again in 2008, Viktor Orban wasn't the same person as it was in the late 90s. I mean, once he got re-elected, he pushed for a new constitution, in which free speech is no longer as absolute as it used to be. It introduces limits to the press. Various other laws at the push of Viktor Orban now push for, let's say, discouraging foreign companies to open a press agency in Budapest and things of that nature. So the trend is downwards these days. That's what I would say. Now, of course, I can expect someone in the comment section will come in and say, "Oh, but Orban is wonderful." Well, I disagree, and this is the reason why I disagree. The trend in the last 6 years, 7 now, since Orban's how do I put a rule started its second chapter in the Hungarian history, the legislative trend has been quite downward, and in this regard, no, I would say at this moment, free speech became quite relative in Hungary.
Well, can you give an example maybe of some of the restrictions? You said that he pushed for a new constitution, and that where free speech was not necessarily given the import that you would expect in a country like that. What were some of the limitations that were put on the press?
Yeah, well, the limitations that were put on the press now, they're quite vague in the Constitution, but once we saw them applied, we kind of understood what exactly the political party that wrote the Constitution meant. It's essentially, if you criticize the government, you can expect quite a lot of harassment in there. And this is kind of that case of the enemy of your enemy is not necessarily your friend. I mean, feminists have been quite the target of the Hungarian government because they dare to criticize the Hungarian government. Now, I have to admit that I was glad when the financial fraud perpetrated by Hungarian feminists with Norwegian funds and the EU funds were exposed to the public. But on the other hand, I knew that this inquiry didn't come because the Hungarian government thought it was right. These inquiries came because the Hungarian government was applying the new constitution, which said that if you dare to criticize the government, we're going to harass you until you disappear or until you start thinking like us. So, yeah.
So it's a little bit maybe milder version of meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yes.
You have free speech until you criticize the people that grant you that freedom, and then it's a different story.
Okay. I mean, admittedly, there's more free speech than it used to be in 1988, for instance, but it's less free speech than it used to be in 2000, for instance. So.
Okay. Now, you mentioned, okay, so the Hungarian government exposed fraud and corruption by feminists, but it was mainly as a retaliatory measure for the feminists criticizing the government there. But that still implies that there is, in process now, efforts by feminists to have influence and sway in Hungarian culture. Can you give us a little picture of what's happening on that front?
Yes, well, this is another thing that many people won't like that I have to say, but it's still true. When it comes to this kind of agitation, especially in Hungary, but also in other nations of Eastern Europe, but especially in Hungary, there's one name that keeps popping up, the name being György Soros, or George Soros. This Hungary essentially is his own playground. I mean, he's Hungarian of ethnicity, and the moment communism fell in '94, I think, he founded the so-called Central European University, which should be more appropriately called the György Soros University. It's entirely funded by his hedge funds and or whatnot, and it's essentially the only university outside of Sweden that teaches all sorts of insanities such as feminist mathematics and things of that nature. I mean, it's either Sweden or Central European University of Budapest that try to push such madness into society. I mean, think about it like this: not even in France, where even psychoanalysis is still given a fair shot, not even in France, feminist mathematics is given any kind of shot. But on the Central European University of Budapest, it is. So whenever we talk about feminists trying to get influence in the Hungarian culture, we have to talk about George Soros, who funds most of these attempts. On the other hand, I presume that George Soros never thinks about why most of the attempts are unsuccessful. And I can tell you why. I spoke with a few feminists last time I went into Hungary, and I got a few of them to admit something that on one hand, they didn't want me to record it. On the other hand, I tried to, but we were outside on a in front of the parliament, and the wind pretty much made the recording quite useless, even though I tried. But essentially, a few of them told me, look, I don't really give a flying tosh about feminism, but I can earn 2 times more than the market wage doing agitation for feminism. So I'm going to do it. So, and that's a portion that neither feminists nor anti-feminists want to hear. And that is most of what we would call feminist ideologues in there are not really ideologues. They're just paid shills, should I say?
Yes, and paid shills are never going to be as effective as true believers. And there's a huge difference in that. So what about Hungarian men? Now, I take it that these agitators that you were speaking with were women. What is the response to feminism, modern feminism, by Hungarian men?
In a word, the response is mostly MGTOW. I mean, most of the Hungarian men that I talked with on these issues were essentially, Bosmeg, I don't give a shit. They can say whatever they want. At the end of the day, I have my own flat on the outskirts of Budapest, and I have my own job, which is most of my job happens in Germany. So I don't care what they say because they can't affect me anymore. And that's what I was trying to explain to them, that look, you depend on a German company. Feminism in Germany is also includes more true believers than it includes in Hungary. And one day you might find yourself, and some of them will find themselves fired because they don't fill the gender quota. Remember, Germany just passed a new law forcing some of its private companies to employ more women because potato. So, and that thing is bound to grow. I mean, the natural progress of government is to grow, and for now it only affects like 300 big corporations, but I'm willing to bet that by 2018 or 2019 it will affect 30,000 companies.
Probably so. What is the family court system like in Hungary? Is that part of the MGTOW inspiration for Hungarian men, or do they feel like that they'll go in there and essentially get raped?
Yes, yes. I mean, the only difference between most family courts in Europe and the family court that you see in the United States, or even dare I say in the United Kingdom, is that money is less involved, and that applies to Hungary as well. I mean, if you end up in a Hungarian family court, you'll definitely lose your children to your wife. That's almost as a given. I mean, gaining custody in Hungary is as likely as getting away without being harassed after you criticize the government. So you have like 4% chances at best to not have that happening to you. On the other hand, losing all your assets, that's very unlikely. Sure, they'll force you to pay some child support, but the child support is usually calculated on how much does it cost to raise a child, and not on how much income you have as an individual. So that usually tends to be quite alleviated. But you'll definitely lose your child, and if you do have two houses, you might lose one of them to your wife. But that's pretty much it. I mean, you won't see the total financial rape that you see in the United Kingdom or in the United States, where you go to jail if you don't pay. No, that kind of thing doesn't yet happen. Neither in Hungary, neither in its neighboring countries. I mean, I've yet to read a case from Eastern Europe with someone going to jail for not paying child support on time. I don't think that happens.
Now, we know that there is some interest. I mean, there isn't exactly, it's not like what's happening in Canada or the US or in some other parts of the world where there is this, or especially places like India, where there is a more and more organized men's movement emerging. But from some people that I have spoken to, there is an interest from some Hungarian men in men's rights issues. Can you give us sort of an explanation of what do you think is driving that?
Yes, the thing is that because of this fear, which is now again quite legitimate, of getting some sort of harassment from the government. And I know two foundations, two NGOs, who do tremendous things. One of them is in Budapest, and one of them is in the city of Szeged. They have a nice day center for boys, where essentially they do mentorship for young teenage boys, and I love their activity. And I begged them to give me an official interview, and they said, no, 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 look, Mr. Valsan, you can take pictures in here if you want, you can talk with the kids, we'll explain you whatever you want, but please don't write anywhere about this. Don't mention our names, don't mention the center, just don't. And at first I thought, well, maybe they don't like my face. And but then I Googled them, and there's almost nothing to find on Google. So essentially, that leads me to the conclusion that they do this thing with all the journalists they encounter, because one of the center exists since 2007, and in 8 years there's almost no mention on the internet about them. So essentially, they try to remain semi-anonymous, or at least away from the public eye. When there's also the other driving force that many don't like, and maybe there's a good reason why they don't like it, and that is the traditional way of doing things. Now there is a problem here. What we called what Hungary calls the traditional way of doing things is slightly different than the traditional way of doing things in the US, for instance. Now, I don't want to sound too bad, although I'm sure someone will take this out of context for me. But I'll put it I'll put it exactly in these terms. Traditionalism in Hungary isn't really that bad. Now, sure, it has some of its gynocentric quirks, like everywhere else in the world. But when you compare it with British traditionalism, well, traditionalism in Hungary is quite fluffy.
Well, let's see if we can clarify that a little bit, because I don't want you taken out of context. Well, who am I kidding? People are going to take you out of context no matter what I want, or no matter what I say, or really no matter what you say. They're going to take it out of context. Somebody will do that. But let's get an idea here. I mean, I would say in 50, 60 years ago in America that traditionalism for the times was not such a bad thing, that there were expectations on both sexes to do a lot of things, and that failure by either one was not rewarded. What we have for traditionalism now in America is that all the expectations are on the man, and the expectations on the woman is to shop as much as possible, and to adorn herself, and to get her nails done, and go to the beauty salon, and maybe write a check to the maid service for doing what women used to do in this culture as a part of their natural social contract with men. We don't see that anymore. So traditionalism in America now, or what is now our tradition, is a horrible deal for men. It's terrible. I mean, men have to be, and they are, I think they are crazy for taking that deal that I will spend a life working myself into an early grave so she can have that fur, or have those, special nail treatments and everything else. So are you saying that in Hungary right now that the tradition is not such a bad deal because there is fairly reasonable?
Yes, it's closer to what you called used to be the deal 50 years ago. It's closer to that, and far less closer to what you see today. I mean, think about it like this. I've talked to several female journalists, including some anti-feminist female journalists in Hungary, and none of them, including, I mean, I talked to a woman who is a journalist and a traditionalist journalist. That's what she calls herself. And, she's a single mother. Her husband died, but she doesn't expect anyone to pay for her shit. I mean, she said, look, I'm a single mother by an accident that happened. Now it's my responsibility to raise my son to adulthood, and no, nobody owes me shit just because I am a single mother. I owe it to my son to be a decent parent, and that kind of mentality is quite widespread amongst throughout the culture, which is one of the reasons why you don't see single motherhood at such high rates almost nowhere in Eastern Europe. Not because single motherhood is punished, but it's not rewarded. I mean, you don't get more special deals on the backs of the taxpayers because you're a single mother. Nobody tries to reward that. At least not on the taxpayers' dime. Now, granted, there are non-governmental organizations who are oriented towards helping single mothers. I see nothing wrong with that. I mean, individuals can do whatever they want with their private donations, but the government just doesn't reward it, and that pretty much contributed to leaving divorce less of a problem than it is anywhere else, and also to fostering a culture within youngsters, which is to say, do I want to have kids? No. Well, in that case, we're not going to get married. So that also cuts back from the divorce rate, because the individuals who don't want to have children don't get married in the first place, so they don't end up divorcing. And it's also another thing in Hungary, just like everywhere else in Eastern Europe, cohabitation is also not punished, as opposed to many other places, most recently the United Kingdom, in which the Supreme Court just handed down a new judgment which essentially punishes couples that engage in what the Brits would call common law marriage, or as we would call it, cohabitation. Essentially, you now still owe money to your girlfriend, even though you were never officially married and you never had kids in the first place. But in Eastern Europe and in Hungary in particular, no, that kind of thing is just totally beneath the government control, essentially.
Well, you just ruined some of my. I had a wonderful plan brewing in my head, Lucian, and you just destroyed it for me. I was going to suggest that maybe we just import a couple of million Hungarian women to the United States, but we would have to bring the government rules with them, and of course, we reward.
Well, importing a couple of million Hungarian women would mean importing all Hungarian women.
Yes,
so.
I know. That's exactly my point. I do notice that Hungary is not a huge country. It's not landmass-wise. It's not a large country. And I know population-wise, I mean, it's fairly densely populated in some areas, but it's not huge. But again, the problem is, and I think you pointed out well, in the United States, and I think we're probably maybe next to India, the United States is the worst country for rewarding promiscuity, for rewarding lies, for rewarding
bad behavior generally, yes.
Yeah, bad behavior and poor life choices, especially in the U.S. Women having multiple children with multiple different partners and collecting from the state for that per child. It becomes almost a cottage industry. Which is now breaking our government, by the way, financially.
Such thing is legally possible in Hungary as well, but thanks to the fact that the government isn't quite wealthy, it makes it quite an awful proposition. I mean, you could do this in Hungary. It will take you something like 6 months until you get through all the bureaucratic hoops. It's quite difficult to get welfare, and that's the case throughout Eastern Europe. It's very difficult to get welfare because the system is designed in the sense that only those who truly need it should get welfare. So that means you have to work for it. I mean, you have to fill a crap ton of forms and stay to queues and expect for some bureaucrats who only work a couple of hours per week. So it takes quite a lot of time. And if you eventually end up doing this, the proposition isn't really that much of a big thing, because the welfare is calculated to ensure that you have minimal survival. It's not meant to live off it. I mean, it's meant to receive it for a few months until you find a new job, and that's it. It's not meant to be a lifestyle. So even if someone would try to do this, it just doesn't worth it. I mean, I'm trying to think now from forints to euros and then to US dollars to give you an idea. Think about it like this. I mean, if you have, let's say, 3 children as a single mother and you want to collect welfare for them, at best, you might end up receiving something like $450 per month. That's not really such a good proposition. I mean, $450 per month for one individual may seem a good proposition, but with 3 children, no, absolutely not. It's not a good idea. And you would have to work like 3 months until you convince the bureaucrats to even hand you that check. So that's why this is another thing, as I was saying, single motherhood and bad behaviors in general are not rewarded in Hungary. They're not actively discouraged in the sense of, I don't know, punishing single mothers for being single mothers or whatnot. But this lack of reward for such choices is quite enough to keep the things quite balanced in this regard, because, you know, people work on incentives. You know, you, Paul, you used to say a few years ago, and when we still had the EVFM radio, that people work on incentives. I mean, if we were to have a law that would allow men to financially rape women in the courtrooms, we could reasonably expect that a portion of men would try to do this. So that's essentially the thing. Women are incentivized to make bad choices in some places in the world, such as India, which is a horrible example, unfortunately. And in other places, such as Hungary, women are not encouraged to make bad choices, but they're not also not discouraged. They're just, the natural incentives. You do this, these are the consequences. And
Yeah,
most women,
we don't, for instance, in the United States, we don't have programs to discourage people from putting their hand on a table and picking up a hammer and smashing their hand. We don't need to have incentives for that because the natural consequences of doing that is troubling enough that people don't need to be told.
excellent analogy, yes.
It is surprising to me how even my own government can look at the millions of women now on welfare rolls and the amount that we have going out in food stamps, in the WIC program. It is absolutely insane. It's literally breaking the country, and nobody will talk about it. Nobody will talk about it in any realistic way. And I think we're probably going to drive ourselves and could drive the world into economic collapse because of gynocentrism that is run amok. And this leads to my next point that I wanted to ask you about. And this is not necessarily about Hungary itself, but something you said sort of cued me to think. I'm wondering if it's possible, do you think, that the level of technology and the higher standard of living is part of what fuels this gender insanity? Our loudest advocates for feminism in the United States are white women from privileged backgrounds who've lived at a higher standard than human beings have ever lived at in history, and they're screaming about being oppressed. The same thing is going on in Canada. These are very, very privileged people that have a standard of living unthinkable for many parts of Hungary and other nations, and yet they feel like something is really owed to them. Yet you have, at a place like Hungary, where the economy is not so good, the standard of living is not so affluent, the expectations, again, are lower, and the assumption is that self-care and self-responsibility are the things that have to guide your life. And so I wonder, do you think there's a correlation between economic success in a nation and ultimately the amount of gynocentrism that goes amok?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, I do agree that there is a slight correlation, although I would argue that the correlation isn't that high. Because think about it like this, the standard of living in India is affluent? No, it isn't. And if you look on the maps, if you look on the map and on one hand on the map of India and on an economic map especially, and on the other hand, you compare the notes provided to us by the folks, which will soon be under the banner of AVFM India. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes.
By the way, AVFM India is in the process of building. I really hope that by the time of our conference, we'll have it finished. So if you look on the economic map, and on the other hand, where are the worst incidents of gynocentrism on steroids in India? It actually correlates with poorer areas. It doesn't correlate with the affluent areas. I mean, yeah, sure, there are some exceptions, such as the Bangalore area, which is a very affluent area in India on one hand, and gynocentrism on steroids on the other hand. But most of the hardcore incidents that are crushing, I mean, if you have a dime of empathy with those men affected in there, it's literally soul crushing. I mean, I couldn't imagine living in such conditions. Those are exactly the areas where the economic conditions haven't yet become affluent. And so that's the reason why I'm not so convinced that economic power is necessarily strongly correlated with gynocentrism. That's not to say that there are no correlations. I mean, I'm looking at my own country, for instance. I live here in northwestern Romania, which is the most affluent portion of the country outside of the capital city and the Black Sea area. Now, the Black Sea port is now the largest importing port in Europe. It's bigger now in terms of merchandise going through here than the Rotterdam port or the other ports in northwestern Europe. So definitely an affluent area. But outside of that area, this portion of Northwest is by far very affluent and I would say comparable to what you would see in Berlin or in Amsterdam. And This is also the portion where there is the highest amount of feminist ideologues per capita. If you look on the other side of the country, the northeastern part of the country, around the city of Iași. Now, the city itself is very rich, but the surroundings of it look pretty much like, I don't know, Detroit. Okay, maybe not Detroit, but close enough. I mean, it's quite desolating what you see around the city. Within the city is affluent, but outside of it, not so much. The University of Iași, the University Alexandru Ioan Cuza, it's the only university in the country where they don't accept gender studies at all. Feminist agitation is totally absent. No professor in there would ever endorse such thing. Also, this bollocks with class analysis and whatnot is totally not permitted in the University of Iași. And the argument by the president of the university is something like, look, we can't afford that. This is an area where we need to produce specialists and smart individuals to lift the area out of poverty. That's what we need to do as a university. We can't afford wasting precious taxpayers' money and precious donors' money to produce gender studies graduates. How would these individuals lift this area out of poverty? Well, that's right, they don't. So that's right.
Yes, I must say, I've never met a gender studies graduate that helped engineer ships. Doesn't happen that way.
Yeah, recently I posted a meme on the AVFM Romania page with a woman holding a sign. I need feminism because my gender studies degree is as valuable as anyone else's degree. And right beneath it, oh well, that's great because they just opened a big gender studies factory nearby. Sorry, I can't take it seriously. So back to the original point. Yes, there is some sort of correlation in this regard. I mean, some areas can literally afford to have this kind of Marxist feminist analysis subsidized, whilst most areas cannot. But as I said, in India, it doesn't really correlate with the economic affluence. So culture is slightly more important than economic affluence. I mean, think about it like this. Poland, for instance, is a very affluent country right now, and there are huge portions of Germany where the standard of living is lower than it is in Poland. And that's because Poland had its market reforms in time, as opposed to Hungary or Romania. Poland had its market reforms in time, so that allowed the economy to boom, essentially. I mean, think about it like this. Poland didn't have a recession since 1993. There have been 2 economic crises in the meantime. Poland didn't suffer about them. And also Poland was the very, very smart country in Europe where it says, oh, shale gas, bring it on, baby. Whilst everyone else was, oh, I don't know, maybe. So that these were 2 factors that allowed Poland to become quite an affluent country. What is the level of influence in Poland of feminism? Well, almost none. When was the last time you heard about the case of gynocentrism in Poland? That's right, not so much. Not so much. And that's because the culture in there is still very much as you would think in the 40s and 50s in America, which is to say our job as individuals, as men and women, is to lift ourselves out of poverty, to become as affluent as possible, to offer our children a better future than we had under communism. That's the mentality in there. Nobody gives a flying tosh about, our boys are playing with trucks and therefore we foster toxic masculinity. Try saying that in Warsaw and see what happens. That's not to say that nobody tried to introduce such bollocks into Poland. I mean, they have a small party there which is all about feminist analysis. But their best performance was in 2008 when they finally managed to surpass the threshold and got 2.4% of the vote. So that's the level of popularity that feminism has in Poland. And in the meantime, it has become lower than that. Compare this to Sweden, where Feminist Initiative had 10%, for crying out loud. and all the other parties are essentially feminist initiative light. So,
Yes, that is what I've heard about Sweden, is that they're all feminist initiatives.
yeah, except for Sverige Demokraterna, but that's a different story. When we'll talk about Sweden, I'll explain those nuances. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. Economic power does correlate with the gynocentrism on steroids or feminism, but not so much. I mean, the correlation is there, but it's weaker than many would think.
Well, and it may be also perhaps when you consider, and even as I was putting the proposition to you, I was cognizant of thinking about India and that how much lower the standard of living there is on average. So I think it may be possible that it's not a singular answer, that it isn't just economic influence. One Indian man explained to me that his belief was that the more traditional a culture, the more gynocentric it was. And India has always been an extremely gynocentric country. There were, I remember watching something a few years ago on television about women being able to walk through bad neighborhoods and nobody would touch them because it was just strictly forbidden. That nobody, if a man tried to do the same thing, he would find himself in trouble. But women could go places unblemished and untouched. And how we got from that to Delhi being the rape capital of the world, I don't know.
Yes. I mean, I guess it all comes down to it, whether in a culture traditional means gynocentric or not. As I'm trying to explain, in Hungary, traditionalism just doesn't mean gynocentrism, at least not to the extent that we would think of in India or in the United States. Whilst in India, you're absolutely correct, traditionalism does mean gynocentrism. I mean, think about it like this. There are 3,000-year-old traditions in portions of India where kissing the feet of every woman that crosses your house is mandatory. And it's a 3,000-year-old tradition. I mean, it's not something that feminists invented yesterday. And in such a culture, I would expect that feminist analysis would catch on far faster than it would catch in Hungary, where kissing a woman's feet is seen as something inherently bizarre. And why would you do that? I mean, so in this regard, yes. I mean, it does depend a little bit on the culture as a whole. Or let's take another example, Senegal. Senegal has a Marxist feminist prime minister, and that's not me saying as an insult to her. It's a woman, Amanita Touré, her name. It's not an insult to her. She calls herself a Marxist feminist. And Senegal is a country that has a standard of living, I don't know, similar to what we see in modern Greece, which is to say closer to third world than to second or first world. Although, to be fair, the economics of Senegal have significantly improved in the last 20 years. It's now quite a livable country, but still still behind most of Europe, or all of Europe. And yet the prime minister is a Marxist feminist. This is just another example that not necessarily the economics are the driving force. In Senegal, as well as in India, there are a significant portion of traditions that are gynocentric in nature and that predate feminism, they predate Marxism, and some of them predate Western culture, to be honest. They predate, I mean, in India, some of the gynocentric traditions predate Judeo-Christianity. They predate a lot of things.
Oh, yes, and there's still, by the way, a lot of people may not know this, in India there are still several areas where it is illegal for a woman to marry a man of lower economic status than her family, that she must marry up.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yep. And I should say, the way the law is worded, it's illegal for a man to marry up.
Yeah. I mean, and it doesn't surprise me that that kind of law still holds in place, because it's the kind of thing that the culture already encourages. I mean, some communist countries, for instance, banned abortion. When communists banned abortion here, there was a tremendous push against it, because in here, abortion was never seen as something very, very bad, as long as it doesn't happen too often. Whilst in Albania, for instance, when communists banned abortion, nobody objected because the norm in Albania was already to have 5 or 6 kids. So nobody noticed, oh, well, by the way, abortion is banned. Well, who cares? We're already going to have 5 or 6 kids anyway as families. So the same goes, I guess, in India as well. When that law was passed, nobody really noticed because, well, women would always marry up anyway. They were encouraged by on every corner of their lives to marry up, and men were also encouraged at every corners of their lives to marry down. So I guess that's why that kind of law resisted and still holds in place. I'm not surprised at all to hear that.
Okay, we're getting fairly close to our time limit here. I want to ask you one final question, and then I want to take a couple of minutes. I want to talk about an article that ran on ABFM Sverige, and to sort of divert, because I think that's an important topic right now. Where do you see Hungary in 20, 25 years if things stay on track the way they are now? Do you see this as a country that is maybe vulnerable to the possibilities of gender feminism taking over ideologically in universities and then affecting governance and public opinion and media and everything else like it has here? Or do you feel like that this is a relatively stable place that is going to stay the course that it's on now and maybe bypass, hopefully escape feminist dogma until feminist dogma finally gets dead and buried?
Well, in order to launch myself in such a prediction, I need to put some caveat in front of it. It depends on how the governance itself develops. I mean, if the governance itself remains in this Viktor Orban authoritarian style, then probably, not probably, then definitely feminist governance stands little to no chance, not because Orban despises feminism. I really don't know if he does or not. Probably he does, but I really don't know. But because he doesn't like competition. And so if Hungary stays on this course, which is officially to divert from liberal democracy, this is in exact words of the Prime Minister, we want Hungary to divert from liberal democracy because look at Turkey and China, how well they're doing it without liberal democracy. So we no longer agree that liberal democracy is a must, which is a very sad thing to say, but well, it's their Prime Minister. They elected him, and they seem to agree with him. Now, granted, the opposition is even worse, but anyway. So yeah, I mean, the opposition is a bunch of fascists. I mean, a bunch of anti-Semitic fascists, old school fascists. So I guess in that regard, maybe Orban doesn't really sound that bad. Anyway,
so Hungary may have bigger problems to face in the future.
So if the governance stays in this way, then definitely feminism stands no chance of at least not to taking over the state. Now that doesn't mean they won't take over the media. They already did take over most of the media. I mean, you remember it was Hufnagel's publication that was banned from an official competition, which his publication was about to win because the feminists whined. Essentially, I mean, there were two feminists who whined to the organizers. Oh, why do we allow that openly MGTOW anti-feminist publication to work in here? And then the organizer said, oh yeah, you're right, and his publication just banned. So the Hungarian media is already feminist-centered. The universities, however, that's more difficult. I mean, yes, there's the Central European University of Gynocentrism, which is feminist no matter how you put it, it is. But the Central European University is a private university at the end of the day. It doesn't receive state funding. The rest of the universities, I really, really doubt that they will be influenced by feminism, at least not in the next 10, 15 years. Maybe later, but I don't think so. I generally think 20 years from now, feminism will be quite a dirty word, as it deserves. So yeah. On the other hand, if let's say tomorrow there is a revolution in Hungary and the Orban government is taken down and a more quote-unquote liberal government is put into place, then if the next government will invite feminism into the country, then maybe it will happen. I suspect, however, that the culture will be able to resist such an assault. One of the reasons why I am involved, I mean, I never spoke about this, but I'll say it quite openly. One of the reasons why I'm a militant anti-feminist, and maybe you can call me an MRA, although I would dispute that label sometimes, it's for purely selfish reasons. I would rather have this cultural war in Central and Western Europe in order to avoid having it here on my own turf. I mean, I would rather have the war early. I'm having an American mentality in here. The military-industrial complex in the U.S. has the same mentality. Let's have the wars overseas as opposed to having them here. That's the way I'm thinking in terms of militant feminism.
Why couldn't we come up with that? I mean, I could just reverse my earlier plan of importing Hungarian women, and we could just ship American women over to Eastern Europe by the millions.
Don't think that thing.
You guys have them for a while.
That might work, and I'm not joking. I mean, I'm half joking, but it could work. I mean, think about it this way. You can Google community of British and American expats in Eastern Europe, and just look at what they say. Don't trust my word. Don't trust the Hungarians' words. Just look at what they say and look at how they evolved. I mean, there are some of them who have blogs since 2004. I mean, some of them have moved 10, 15 years ago, have moved here or in Hungary or in Serbia. And look at how their language evolved. I mean, in 2004 or 2003, they were like, oh, but this culture, I don't think I can adapt to it. And then 10 years later, when they read the American news, they read it through Eastern European news eyes. And they see the inherent insanity that there is in some of them. So yeah, that might work. I mean, one of the reasons why I insisted to have an international branch of AVFM was precisely that, because people just don't travel. I am a well-traveled man, but most people I know, even from my own country or from other places, they just don't travel. And it's a sad thing to say, but I would say that I know you are a well-traveled man as well, Paul, but I'm still surprised that so many Americans who can afford to travel a lot, they don't. And maybe they should. Just to see a little, I mean, when I see some of the articles, even on the pages of AVFM, which are completely ignorant of most of the planet, and it's come up with bold assertions that maybe apply into one or two. Some of them don't even apply, and I know they don't apply to the entire United States, let alone the whole world. And and I don't know, just travel more. That's what I'm saying. Travel more, because there is a whole planet out there. And whilst we always say that, oh well, feminism takes care of every single country one step at a time, but the countries are at different stages of development. So there are quite a lot of differences, and you become a better person if you take at least, or at least try to take the good things out of every single culture. For instance, I took the work discipline from Hungarians. They have a far better work discipline than we have here in Romania.
Yeah, I have to agree with that totally, and it's one of the reasons that I think traveling a lot, what it's done for me, I traveled a lot in the service when I was in the U.S. Army, and then I've traveled as often as I can, honestly, as often as I can afford to, from the United States into Europe, other places. There is a lot. The world is Americentric in many ways. Your average, what I would call a foreigner, somebody that lives away from America, will know 10 times more about my country than I know about theirs at any given time. And that's why we're trying to do these shows, because we find that a lot of people need to wake up to the fact that even within ABFM and in other organizations, that there are different cultures, different realities, different things happening out there that are worthwhile lessons for all of us. Let's move on.
Hold on a second. One last thing I have to say about Hungarian non-feminism.
Sure.
And that is to say that, at least for now, and that's why I'm looking forward to have the AVFM Hungary finally built, one big issue that I see right now is that most of the opposition comes from not from a Hungarian traditionalist point of view, but from a Hungarian fundamentalist Christian point of view. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing per se, but when that is the only voice, that comes with some risks long run. I mean, if feminism gets more foot within the Hungarian culture, we wouldn't want the sole opposition to be on the hands of fundamentalist Christians or in the hands of Jobbik being the fascist party. We just don't want that. And that's why I'm looking forward. And by the way, if you're watching this and you speak Hungarian, and especially if you can write Hungarian, I can understand and sometimes speak Hungarian, but spelling is a mess. If you can write Hungarian, please drop me a line and help us build AVFM Hungary. It's almost done. So yeah.
But you will be needing contributors to that site to bring new material and
yeah,
news.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so let me reiterate that and ask if you're at all proficient in Hungarian and writing Hungarian, please contact him at lucian@avoiceformen.com, and he will get you hooked up so that we can have our next domino in taking over the world, which we're hardly doing, but we're at least trying to get this counter theory out there. And I'm going to say before we move on to Sweden that I don't have anything against religious people. I do not. Matter of fact, I think that in some ways, in some areas, religion has been a very stabilizing influence in the lives of people, and I appreciate that. But I will also say that life under a theocracy, to me, is just as scary as a life under feminist governance. So I wouldn't want those to be my two choices either, which is why we need to have other options for people. Now, the other day, a few days ago, I got up and I did my routine. I always do my routine. I get up in the morning, I make some hot tea, and I go in and I look at traffic statistics all across AVFM, all the countries, and I noticed that things at AVFM Sweden, at AVFM Sverige, were absolutely haywire. And you know what? It's several days later, and it's still busy. Why don't you tell us why so many Swedes tuned into that? Because we were used to, 1,000 visitors in a day, 800, something like that, at the Swedish website, just, moderate traffic. And all of a sudden, I know the first 2 days of an article, it was hit 35,000 times.
Yes.
What happened?
Well, it's not the first time, but definitely this time was the most spectacular increase in traffic. There have been several instances before. What happened is that we, and by we I mean William Anderson first and foremost, and with some of my assistants, we published a story of a man named Svante White, who essentially said, you know what, fuck Sweden. Seriously. I mean, you can find now the article has, in the meantime, been translated into English, and you can find it on the English site as well. It's called I've Had Enough, I'm Leaving Sweden. That's, I think the title is in English. Is a Swedish entrepreneur took offense, essentially took Man Woman Myth's advice. If every one of you remember, 2 years ago, Man Woman Myth published a video saying whenever gender ideologues talk badly about men, take it personally. They speak about you. That's the mentality that they promote about you. And Svante White actually did that. Now she's the Åsa Romson is the deputy prime minister, but at that time she was running for that position. There is a political event in Sweden called Almeladen, and then there she held a long speech, which was essentially an entire diatribe against white Swedish middle-aged straight men. And Svante White said, "Enough with this bollocks. I mean, she's talking about me." When she became deputy prime minister, he said, okay, that's enough. Enough is enough. I'm going to liquidate all my business and my assets in Sweden. I'm going to sell my house, sell everything, and just leave this place permanently. And he did just that. I mean, he's still in Sweden. He'll be leaving on April 7th, but he already sold all his business, all his assets, and he's taking all his millions with him away from Sweden. And he essentially wrote a very short article. I mean, under normal conditions, that wouldn't fill the quota that we have on AVFM, at least 500 words. I don't think it even has 500 words. He wrote a short article saying, look, she's talking about me. So, okay, that means I'm no longer desired. And by the way, who am I, this bad, straight, white, heterosexual, whatever, middle-aged man? Who am I? Well, I am a person who started up 5 companies that created employment for that many people, most of them immigrants. I'm a person who created this and that and exported millions of dollars, goods worth millions of dollars, and helped the Swedish economy. Essentially, I helped the Swedish economy far more than the Deputy Prime Minister ever has. And she said,
created jobs in the process.
Yes, and created jobs in the process. And she says that I am a very bad person because of my skin color and my sex and my age and my sexual orientation. Well, then I'm just going to leave this place, because if I am the root of all evil, well, then just let's cut the evil from the root, right? And that story went viral because it hit the chord with so many other Swedish people. That's what I try to explain to many people. Mr. Svante White's story is not unique. What's special about it is that finally the mainstream media picked up the story. I mean, it was republished on Nyheter CNFE or News 24, and that's how it became even more relevant within the Swedish discourse. But what Mr. Svante White did is not a special thing. 2014 was the 3rd year in the row when when more people permanently emigrated from Sweden than people immigrated into Sweden. I mean, when I say that Sweden is going through a population replacing process, people call me a fascist or a far right, but it's not. It's not a fascist point to make. It's a reality. Productive individuals are leaving Sweden, especially productive men. And instead of them, nobody comes in, or if it does, it's definitely individuals who are less productive than the ones who have left. And I am afraid, I hope I will be wrong with this prediction, I really do, but I am afraid that there is such thing as point of no return. And I am afraid that Sweden is already passed beyond that point of no return. I really, really hope I'm wrong with this. But if I'm not, things aren't looking great into the future.
I hate to sound sadistic, but I've got to tell you that I really kind of hope you're right, and that the event horizon has passed for Sweden, hopefully to set an example. And Lucian's correct. Stating the numbers, math is not fascist. Mathematics is not fascist. It is mathematics. And if you are losing your talent, and you are gaining state-dependent welfare recipients at quick rates, you're going to fail. It's going to happen. Sounds like you have a large ship coming through your area.
No, it's a working facility close by, and they promised me that they won't start so early in the morning. Well, I guess they lied.
They lied to you. They want to be productive. It must be men.
Yeah, definitely.
So, okay, well, we're going to wrap things up. Let me remind everybody right now that this is AVFM's quarterly fundraiser. We are, as always, trying to meet our goals so that we can continue to bring you programming and that we can do activism. We are preparing for a lot of things coming up in October in Houston. Is the 2nd International Conference on Men's Issues, which is promising to be a very big step up from the first one, although the first one was really wonderful. We are opening a publishing house, and by the way, Lucian Valsan will be working a lot with getting men's rights and anti-feminist literature translated into various different languages for publishing so that we can spread the word even more. There is a lot of things on our horizon that we're trying to push toward. As Sweden pushes toward falling off into the ocean, we are trying to push ourselves up onto dry land, and we would appreciate your help if you'll visit avoiceformen.com, and you'll see the donation article on the front page, and put something in the tip jar. You can help us with that. Also, I want to say congrats to William Anderson for the incredible job that he's doing over at ABFM Sweden with Lucian's help. Lucian, by the way, is some of you probably know, is our director of multi-site operations. Basically, every foreign language site that you have seen, whether it's Farsi, Hebrew, Italian, Swedish, we can go down the list of all the, I think it's 9 different languages that ABFM is published in right now. A lot of that is because of Lucian's sweat behind the scenes. So thank you for that, Lucian. And with that, I'll ask you if you've got anything final you want to say to the troops out there, and we'll let you get on about your sunny day, and I will try to, at 2 o'clock in the morning here, get some sleep.
Yeah, well, essentially, if you speak Hungarian, don't forget to drop me a line. If you speak any other language that ABFM is published in, don't forget to drop me a line. And and let's try to build this thing even further. By the way, there's a huge need of someone who speaks Hebrew. Please help us with that. And with that being said, I guess nothing else now, at least when it concerns Hungary. Oh yeah, next show when we'll have it, which will probably be a month from now. But anyway, we're gonna tackle Sweden. I promise you, it's gonna be a nice show. And other than that, I don't know. Take the red pill.
Take it, folks. Take it every day and never stop. You guys take care.